They are just not like us. The role of media in othering people and communities. Print and news media play a big role in shaping our understanding of what is going on around us, near and far, and in shaping our understanding of groups of people. Media also plays a central role in creating and maintaining cultural values. Which stories are selected to be covered and why? Who is reporting on the story? Who is impacted by the coverage of this story? What is the language used in communicating this story? Asking these questions allows us to think critically about the impact of news media coverage. Some scholars argue that the nature of news media is not only representing reality, but constructing reality through narrative. Despite our common understanding that journalists only objectively report events and facts, newsmakers engage in a highly subjective and selective process of news production, based on socially and culturally constructed criteria. In Canada and in most of the global north, many of these decisions have historically been filtered through a predominantly Western, white, heteronormative, middle-class male lens. As many of our mainstream news outlets share these common roots still, the coverage of minority and marginalized peoples can contribute to othering. Othering is a process in which people are considered fundamentally different from oneself, whose very existence is in opposition to and contrasted with us, the default. The concept of othering comes in part from the work of author and professor Edward Said. Said explored the interactions between British colonizers and the Orient, in itself a constructed geography that spanned much of Asia. Said described the concept of Orientalism, where evidence about the people, places, and cultures in the diverse Orient were only made credible after they were written about and described by colonial Western powers. As a historian of the colonial narrative, Said suggested that colonialism takes place not only through armies and conquest, but also through literature, anthropology, justified through narratives. The West painted a picture of the East that set up a binary, us versus them, rational versus irrational, civilized versus uncivilized. This process of othering happens in contemporary Canadian media as well, particularly in the coverage of Indigenous people and communities. Here's what it might look like. Persistent racialized stereotypes, lack of Indigenous voices and experts in reporting, uneven coverage in terms of space and time given to stories, or a lack of complexity in historical context. For example, sociologist Kirsten Gilchrist compared the local press coverage of similar cases: 3 missing or murdered Indigenous women from Saskatchewan and 3 missing or murdered white women from Ontario. The Indigenous women received 3.5 times less coverage. Their articles were shorter and less likely to appear on the front page. Depictions of the Indigenous women were also more detached in tone and scarce in detail in contrast to the more intimate portraits of white women. The press demonstrated a continued compassionate response to the white women, while the Indigenous women were largely ignored and thus relegated to the status of other. This also decreases the spatial and cultural proximity to the audience, making it difficult for the general public to empathize with the stories of Indigenous women in the same way. This has happened throughout history and is ongoing. Most recently, in the coverage of the murder of 15-year-old Tina Fontaine, many news organizations chose to focus on the minor's personal history and struggle with substance use rather than the crime itself and the perpetrator. These value judgments made by news organizations about what constitutes a crime or victim worthy of attention and who and what is newsworthy contributes to the systemic inequities present in Canada. Another example is surrounding the coverage of the Idle No More movement. Media often presented Indigenous groups, which includes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, as a monolithic body, even though the movement consisted of hundreds of nations with diverse perspectives. This is another way othering occurs, by homogenizing the experiences of minority and marginalized groups. Writer Albert Memmi suggests that those whose views are homogenized are drowning in an anonymous collectivity. So where do we go from here? There are several steps journalists and others working in news media can take to minimize the process of othering. Many studies have shown that there is a significant lack of diversity in Canadian journalism. Increasing the representation of marginalized peoples in the reporting and storytelling can go a long way in minimizing the process of othering. Media representations can also help to challenge injustice by integrating critiques of structural power relations and inequities into public discourse.